Today is the first special video of the month, and that means it's a subject that's been chosen by the patrons on Patreon. I must have really done something to irritate them this time, because their chosen subject is the developmental history of French pre-dreadnoughts. Whatever I did, I promise I will try and make it up to you. But never mind. You have asked, and therefore you shall receive. So, the French Navy in the latter part of the 19th century was a fairly interesting and diverse bunch, to say the least. They had, of course, kick-started the ironclad warship revolution with La Gloire. They'd then gone in a number of rather interesting directions when it came to ironclad warship design, including trying to make a ship-of-the-line Age of Sail style, except with iron, in the shape of this rather wonderful ship and its sister, that's Solferino and Magenta. They then moved on, as had everybody else, to central battery ironclads, and from there to the open barbette ship, which was a precursor of the pre-dreadnought. As you might notice from these photos, a tendency towards the tumble-home design of warship had begun to influence French armoured warship construction pretty early in its gestation, and this would express itself quite considerably during much of the pre-dreadnought era as well. The idea of tumble-home design was to allow the ships to be more seaworthy, as by narrowing the hull quite considerably the further up you went, you, in theory, would reduce the amount of top weight, and therefore you could make the ship with a much higher freeboard than you could in a more conventional slab-sided or flared design. This, in turn, meant that you could mount the guns higher, and of course, being mounted much higher, they were kept clear of the sea in considerably higher sea states. This was all very well, and tumble-home warships proved very adept at navigating narrow passageways such as canals and locks. However, they did have one rather unfortunate side effect, which was that their margin of stability when the ships began to flood through combat damage was minimal to non-existent, as would be borne out in combat later down the line. But that's a story for another time. So now you know briefly what tumble-home design is. Let's look into the start of the French pre-dreadnoughts. The last French ships to be built before the first French pre-dreadnought were, at least in terms of capital ships, the Marceau class, consisting, logically enough, of the Marceau, the Magenta, and the Neptune. However, this class was started in 1880, and after this, due to a change of French thinking temporarily to the Jeune École, which was, as has been discussed in other videos, a school of thinking that held that submarines, torpedo boats, and other light warships such as cruisers could bring an enemy to their knees via commerce raiding and lightning attacks. The French Navy didn't actually start on any further capital ships for approximately 10 years, with the Charles Martel class being cancelled midway through the 1880s as a result of the new naval administration with their new ideas. However, by the beginning of the 1890s, the Jeune École was beginning to weaken its stranglehold on French naval thinking, and of course there was another rather large elephant in the room in the form of the 1889 Naval Defence Act passed in the British Parliament. You see, up until this point, British battleships of various sorts had been manufactured in ones and twos and odds and ends, and weird designs aplenty. However, this particular Defence Act rather pulled the rug out of that little paradigm of operations by demanding a lot of battleships. It ordered, over the next 5 years, 8 first-class battleships and 2 second-class battleships, mainly designed for operations in the Pacific, where they were designed to hunt down armoured cruisers. Now, an entire mass class of battleships? This was something that the French needed to respond to, and they needed to respond to quickly. The cancelled Charles Martel class were revisited, and one of the ships, the Brennus, named after a Gaulish chieftain who would have the distinction of being the last person to sack Rome for quite a few hundred years, and also the originator of those immortal words Vae Victis, or Woe to the Vanquished, would be redesigned in response to the Royal Navy's new class of ship, which would become the Royal Sovereign class. Using some of the materials left over from the first iteration of the ship and on the same slipway, the new Brennus began construction. This ship would be armed with quite the variety of armament, with a main battery of 13.4-inch or 340mm guns. However, there were only 3 of these, in a twin turret forward and a single turret aft. A secondary battery of 164mm or 6.4-inch guns was arranged in a variety of casemates and single turrets on 2 different levels on either side of the ship. You then had a tertiary battery of 4 65mm or 2.6-inch guns, a quaternary battery of 14 47mm or 1.9-inch guns, a quintenary battery of 8 37mm guns, and 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, just for good measure. The ram bow was deleted, steel armour was brought in instead of iron, and new Belleville boilers were also introduced. This gave the ship a speed of 18 knots with a total indicated horsepower of 13,900 running on 2 shafts, and a shallow main armour belt 18 inches thick, with 18-inch armour on the main turrets as well. One of the other problems with the tumble-home design was it meant there was relatively little space in the hull for such things as accommodation, and so the ship completed with a massive superstructure. This, as well as various inefficiencies in the yard, meant that the ship was, shall we say, a little bit overweight. When she went out on trials, this is bearing in mind on trials, so she's not at full displacement yet, the draft was already over a foot more than it should have been, which, combined with the relatively shallow belt, meant that the vast majority of the ship's armour protection was now below the water. This only got worse once the ship was fully stocked and loaded for war, and would eventually require a reconstruction in order to prevent her from gaining so much instability that she would just possibly roll over at random. Nevertheless, one hastily redesigned, rather unstable semi-pre-dreadnought was not exactly the world's best response to a navy that was producing an entire fleet of brand new battleships, and so the French needed a much bigger and better response than just the poor old Brennus. And so now faced with the very real possibility that the Royal Sovereign class might allow the Royal Navy to dominate the Mediterranean and completely uncontested, the French responded with a rather sweeping and ambitious law, the Statute Naval of 1890, which called for a squadron of 24 first-class battleships, a coastal defence fleet of 17 coastal defence battleships, and showing that the Jeu Nicole hadn't quite lost its grip, 220 torpedo boats, as well as an overseas fleet of 34 cruisers. However, whilst the Royal Navy's programme, with the exception of HMS Hood, which was a throwback to the old school of turret design, would produce battleships of the same class and therefore generally uniform capability, the French programme called for an initial tranche of 4 battleships to be laid down, but right from the start these were never going to be the same, with invitations to tender going out, with 4 separate contracts for 4 separate ships promised to 4 separate winners. The key parameters were displacement, armament, thickness of the armour belt, and the armour on the main turrets, but otherwise everything else was up to the designers. They could decide what the hull's overall dimensions were going to be, what the hull form was going to be, what it was going to look like in silhouette, where the medium secondary guns were going to be, how much power and where the machinery was going to be placed, what kind of protection system they were going to use, and bear in mind this is just after the Italians were looking at a completely unarmoured battleship. So yes, it was, shall we say, a rather interesting design competition. And this competition would actually end up with 5 ships rather than 4, just to give you some idea of the flavour of how different these 5 ships would actually end up being. One of them would have a secondary battery in twin turrets, whilst all the others had the secondary battery in singles. 3 ships had 2 engines driving 2 propeller shafts, whilst the other 2 had 3 engines driving 3 propeller shafts. Load for displacement varied between 11,800 and 12,200 tons, length varied by up to 10 metres, and horsepower by up to 2,000. Collectively, even the French would term this little batch of ships the Flotte d'Échantillons, or Fleet of Samples, or Patchwork Fleet. These ships would consist of the Charles Martel, which was reusing the name of the other ship that had been cancelled in the mid-1880s, the Carnot, the Messina, the Bouvet, and the Jauriguiberi, I think. Possibly, maybe. As the designs progressed, great concern was expressed as the displacement seemed to be going up and up and up, and with the problems encountered by Brennus so close in mind, permission was given to consider replacement of the 340mm gun with a new 305mm gun. At the time, the French had quite the variety of calibers when it came to their main battery weapons, and they rather liked the 274mm or 10.8-inch gun. The new 305mm under development was supposed to be able to penetrate about the same amount of armour as the 274mm gun, but at twice the range. The weight of the 305mm gun would obviously be considerably less than a 340, and so approval was given to swap the main armament from the 340 down to the 305. Now, if you thought Brennus's main armament was eclectic, Charles Martel takes the cake, the biscuit, and quite probably the container as well. Its main armament consisted of 2 single 305mm guns, 2 single 274mm guns in a secondary battery, a tertiary battery of 8 138mm guns, again in single mounts, variety of casements and turrets, a quaternary battery of 8 65mm guns, all singles, a quintenary battery of 12 47mm guns, again all singles, and a sextenary battery of 8 37mm guns, again all in singles, plus 4 torpedo tube launchers, because of course it did. Speed was 17 to 18 knots, and main armour was between 12 and 18 inches thick, with a slightly expanded power plant of 13,500 horsepower, driving 2 shafts compared to Brennus. Whilst this bizarre and eclectic main armament might seem a little bit ineffective, and indeed it gave a weight of broadside that was almost a ton less than that of the Royal Sovereigns, it did have one advantage in that the lighter 305 and 274mm guns had a theoretical rate of fire about twice that of the 13.5-inch guns on the Royal Sovereigns, which meant that in theory you could hit an enemy with more shells, even if those shells were perhaps somewhat less effective. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, 18 inches of armour, that's quite a substantial bit of protection, especially for an early pre-dreadnought. And yes, on paper you'd be correct. However, there are 2 factors to consider. One is the fact that this is not, in fact, the Krupp steel that you would expect to find on a World War I or World War II dreadnought battleship, or even on a later pre-dreadnought. It is, in fact, a Le Creusot variant of Harvey nickel steel, and so its overall resistive power is somewhat less than what we normally think of in terms of battleship armament. And second, as mentioned with the Brennus, the French armour belt layout tended to be very shallow. Exactly how these early French pre-dreadnoughts were protected is best explained by the diagram shown above at the moment, but effectively the main belt protection for the ship's hull was completely separate from the main battery protection much higher up in the ship, with a relatively thin upper belt and an armoured deck that was designed primarily to deflect and break up incoming shells that were hitting above the magazine and coal bunker levels, with the main belt being a very narrow strip that was just designed to protect the waterline of the ship, with the coal bunkers behind providing additional protection. Whilst Brennus had something of a tumble home, the Charles Martel went all in with it, in part to give the secondary and tertiary batteries better firing arcs, considering their variety of turrets and casemates mounted all down the sides. Carnot was the next ship in line, and as you can see it looked completely different on terms of superstructure, although the main armament was roughly the same. It did also, however, possess slightly better armour protection with thicker and slightly taller secondary armour protection and armour decks in various places throughout the ship, which led to the ship being slightly slower at just over 17 knots, despite having a slightly greater power plant. The sheer number of openings in the hull, also known as scuttles, drew a fair bit of criticism, albeit that it did kind of look like a return all the way back to the Age of Sail, since one could easily imagine lots of cannons sticking out of this ship, as I'm sure you can probably think now. Jauriguiberi went completely the other way, with a relatively minimal superstructure. However, the ship was physically shorter and wider than the other two half-sisters that we've looked at so far, and was one of the ships that went in with twin mountings for the tertiary armament as opposed to the singles present on the other ships. It also appeared to steal its funnels from a factory rather than the somewhat slimmer units found on Carnot and Charles Martel, and as a result looked completely different again. And now we move on from the least pronounceable to the most visually offensive, the Messina, which appeared to take the basic hull of a torpedo ram and attach a hotel block to the top of it, resulting in quite possibly one of the most terrible-looking pre-dreadnought battleships of all time. It did, however, also change the armament around somewhat, with the 65mm guns present in the previous three ships being swapped for 100mm or 3.9-inch weapons, which were intended to supplement the 138mm or 5.5-inch tertiary battery, which just would result in a lot of confused splashes, to be perfectly honest, in an actual fight. She would, however, introduce three-shaft propulsion, which would remain a fairly constant feature of French pre-dreadnoughts going forwards, but, like Brennus, would complete massively overweight and was otherwise generally regarded as something of a failure in this five-ship category. And finally, we have the least visually offensive of the five ships, the Bouvet, which still had the tumble home, but significantly fewer scuttles, a much reduced superstructure, but also a much more built-up stern area. She also mounted a slightly experimental version of the 305mm gun, which meant that her firepower characteristics were subtly different to the other four. As with Messina, she substituted 100mm guns for the 65mm guns of the first three ships. In the late 19th century, the French Navy was actually close to the forefront of fire control technology, and so various rangefinders and fire control systems of surprising complexity could be found aboard all five ships to varying degrees, as you can see in the pictures appearing above. However, this was slightly complicated by the fact that each turret was given its own fire control system, so on most of these ships that meant a total of 16 separate fire control sections just for the turrets, and then the light anti-torpedo boat weaponry was further divided into 5 overall sections, which corresponded roughly to sections of the ship, such as foremast platform, mainmast platform, upper bridge, shelter deck amidships, and aft superstructure. Advances in Le Creusot's ability to produce nickel-steel armour also meant that by the time you got to Bouvet, the armour protection was narrowed from 450mm to 400mm on the basis that this provided exactly the same physical protection due to the advances in the steel manufacturing, whilst obviously saving a significant amount of weight for displacement. She was also much more heavily electrified than the other ships of this loose collection, with a number of electrical generators and lots of electrical equipment installed, along with other changes such as other variants to armour thickness in places like the ship's barbettes. This meant that Bouvet underwent quite a number of modifications while she was still under construction, partly to try and save weight as a result of other modifications that were being made, and partly because various new ideas were being trialled. As a result, she would come out with a relatively marginal level of stability and buoyancy, which would be evidenced later on in her loss during World War I. Unfortunately, this cavalcade of rather interesting and very varying ships did not help French naval matters very much, as by the time, thanks to all the delays and infighting, that these ships were all commissioned and in service, They didn't just have to worry about the Royal Sovereigns, they also had to worry about the 9-strong Majestic class, which are generally considered to be the origin of the classic pre-dreadnought battleship. So the Royal Navy was now rolling around with 7 Royal Sovereigns, 9 Majestics, plus the Royal Sovereign variant HMS Hood, and the French had 5 rather heterogeneous vessels armed with anything between 5 and 6 different types of guns, of which 4 could be expected to be firing at battle range. Thus, despite their relatively advanced fire control systems, spotting the difference in shell splashes between those main, secondary, tertiary and quaternary batteries was going to be a rather interesting challenge, to say the least. Louis-Émile Bertin, who was tasked with being Director of Naval Construction in the late 1890s, would describe all of these ships as chavaribal, or liable to capsize, which isn't exactly a glowing recommendation. However, for their size, they did have a considerable amount of firepower. They did introduce new homogeneous steel armour, as opposed to the previous ironclad ships, and they were capable of a fairly high speed for ships of the period, at least when they were new out of the dockyard. They were, however, very compact, very limited in capability as a result of this, and really resembled more of a kind of floating fortress or hotel block armed with numerous different types of guns, as opposed to the Royal Sovereigns and Majestics, which actually managed to look the part of a seagoing battleship. And if that sounds harsh, that's the French Navy's own evaluation of them. As the mid-1890s rolled around, the French Navy tried to resolve some of these issues by aiming for a much more homogeneous class of pre-dreadnought battleships. Unfortunately, thanks to various political shenanigans, they were told that they would have to come up with a new generation of improved battleships, but on a lesser displacement. In order to do this, they initially considered bringing the 2 305mm guns into a twin turret forward and the 2 274mm guns into a twin turret aft, but luckily saner heads prevailed and the ships would be armed with 4 305mm or 12-inch guns in 2 twin turrets, one fore and one aft, which made them look considerably more conventional. They would, however, still have a very bulbous stuck-out bow, raking back quite significantly, and of course would maintain the tumble home found on previous French pre-dreadnoughts, which we've already discussed. The rest of the armament, you'll be happy to know, was not quite as complex as on the Charles Martels, with a secondary battery of 10 single 138mm or 5.5-inch guns, then 8 single 100mm guns, similar to Bouvet and Messina, and these made up the tertiary battery, followed by a quaternary battery of 20 single 47mm guns. And that was it, apart from, of course, 4 torpedo tubes. The 3 ships of the class would be Charlemagne, Saint-Louis, and Gallois. As mounting a pair of heavy twin turrets so high up in the ship as allowed for by the freeboard of the tumble-home design would give the ship significant stability issues if the approach found in the Charles Martels was followed elsewhere, the rest of the ship's armament would be displaced to casement mounts or open deck mounts, depending on the calibre of the gun. That isn't to say that the slightly more crazy French designers didn't try and get their act in. They did, and a number of design submissions for this class were rejected, which included the mounting of the secondary battery and turrets whilst moving the primary battery into open barbettes again, for some bizarre reason. The 3 ships would incorporate many of the advancements found in Messina, but as these were designed in from the start, they were actually included in a far more sensible manner, which meant that the ships were at somewhat less risk of completing dramatically overweight and in a completely random fashion. Nevertheless, despite being a much more closely related class, there were still significant differences, with St. Louis having a completely different turret manufacturer with a completely different turret design compared to Charlemagne and Gallois, which rather complicated maintenance issues. The belt armour was once again manufactured by the French versions of Harvey nickel steel, but it was still homogeneous steel armour, not face-hardened, and therefore retained its 400mm or 18-inch thickness. Speed for the class would be roughly 17 knots, but again in a wonderfully French manner. There were differences between the ships when it came to propulsion. The propeller diameter was 4 metres in Charlemagne, 4.3 metres in Gaulois, and 4.3 metres on the wing propellers and 4.1 metres on the centre propeller in Saint Louis, which of course meant slightly different propulsion characteristics for each of the ships. The Charlemagnes were a significant advance on the Charles Martels, most especially obviously the last of them, the Bouvet, and proved to be fairly stable gunnery boats. However, they were fairly terrible at seakeeping. This isn't necessarily a flaw of the design, it's simply because the French were trying to cram as much or more as they had into Bouvet onto a smaller ship. With an increase in displacement, most of these issues would probably have been solved, and the ships would have been much more successful in service. Nevertheless, they did represent a significant increase in French combat power over the Bouvet, partly because of the various technological advances, but also because, despite their differences, they were a lot closer together in terms of relative capability than any two of the Charles Martels, which meant that there was a hope that you could actually operate them as a single unified squadron. Next, technically speaking, would come the Henri IV, a just under 9,000-ton pre-dreadnought battleship, although I say battleship in quotation marks, because it really doesn't match the rest of the French design lineage, and it's only armed with a pair of 274mm guns as its main armament, which makes it less well armed than some armoured cruisers, and even the German coastal defence pre-dreadnoughts are significantly outgun it. So I think it's best to leave that ship to one side and look at it as its own separate unit at some point in the future. Having recognised their mistake in limiting the Charlemagne class to 11,000 tons or thereabouts, the next ship to be ordered, the Battleship Ienna, would be allowed to have an increased displacement of up to 12,000 tons normal and designed, but this came with a number of stipulations and riders. Speed was to come back up to 18 knots, range was to be significantly increased to allow for better operational capabilities, and armour was to be increased in all sorts of areas, as the thinning of armour that had started as a trend in Messina and Bouvet was not seen as particularly desirable, given the slight problem of enemy guns not really caring that much about your design constraints. It was also proposed to upgrade the secondary battery from 138mm to 164mm guns, but this would have come at the expense of deleting one of the main guns, which would have lent to a Brenner-style 2 forward 1 aft arrangement when it came to firepower. The designer, Monsieur Thibaudier, luckily came up with a fairly good solution. He would use a higher grade of armour steel to allow for, again, similar protection but with less thickness, thus preserving weight, and he would reduce the 138mm battery by 2 guns and upgrade the remaining secondary battery to 164mm weapons, which would in turn allow him to retain the 2 twin turrets of 305mm or 12-inch guns for the main armament. As a result, the total armament of the Ienna would consist of 4 305mm guns in 2 twin turrets, 8 single 164mm or 6.5-inch guns, 8 single 100mm guns, 16 single 47mm guns, and of course the obligatory 4 torpedo tubes. The main guns were also a modified version with a much larger firing chamber that allowed the use of a considerably more powerful gun charge, which gave the 305mm guns extended range and armour penetration capabilities as compared to the previous ships. Although the size and bulk of the superstructure was creeping up again after Bouvet's valiant attempts to reduce it, The ship was also protected by Harvey nickel steel that was now cemented and face hardened, which meant that the overall thickness of the armour could be reduced quite considerably to 320mm at its thickest point, or 12.6 inches, which obviously saved a considerable amount of weight, in addition to Thibaudier's decision to simply use a higher grade of steel in the first place. Overall, Ienna could be considered quite the success, especially compared to its predecessors. It was relatively fast, fairly manoeuvrable, it was a fairly good gun platform, and the only real criticism of it was that the fire control systems found it difficult to maintain a solution above 16 and a bit knots. But that wasn't exactly a massive mark against the ship, considering the many and varied issues of the previous designs. There were still issues with having multiple gun types in terms of having a primary, secondary, and tertiary battery that would all try to engage at long range, and the guns were perhaps too close together when it came to the secondary and tertiary weapons. Additionally, the conning tower was held to be fairly small and cramped, even though this was where French ships were supposed to be commanded from. But on the other hand, the bridge was very well laid out and received quite favourably in peacetime operations and cruising operations by the various command crews who served aboard her. So overall, despite a few flaws, which every ship has, Ienna was a very good example of French pre-dreadnought design. Next came Suffren, or Suffren, which was supposed to be a modified version of Ienna. However, as the various demands of the French Naval Construction Board came in, it would eventually end up being an almost entirely new design. One of the most notable visual differences was the fact that the secondary battery of 164mm guns was now split in a return to a much older design criteria, with single turrets and casement mounts ranged along the sides. As her dimensions were larger than Ienna, who in turn had been larger than the Charlemagne's, the slipway that she was to be constructed on needed extension first before she could be started. The belt armour was also thinned by 20mm to 300mm, or 11.8 inches. However, it covered more area at this thickness than the tapering belt of Ienna. The pronounced tumble home of earlier ship designs was also gradually disappearing at this time. Although it was still present visibly on French warships, it posed something of a reduced risk to stability during combat conditions as compared to something like the Charlemagne class. Whilst Suffren did represent an improvement in combat capability over Ienna, in the French Navy's own evaluation, they saw a return to the same kind of principles that had governed the Flotte de Chantillon right at the beginning of their pre-dreadnought efforts, since, as opposed to the Charlemagne's, they'd now ended up with two additional ships of considerably different design. They're also looking across the pond, or across the channel, I should say, to the British, as during the same period of 1893 to 1901, the Royal Navy had received 29 first-class battleships, all with a uniform armament of 4 12-inch guns and 12 6-inch guns on the secondaries in 5 different classes. During the same period, however, the incremental and scattered efforts of the French Navy had only produced 6 ships, of which only 3 were to the same design. They attempted, therefore, to get things back on track with the Patrie class. This, at a total of 6 ships, would be the largest class of French battleships ordered since the Flandre class of ironclads early in the Iron and Steam era. These ships would represent a major step forward in French battleship design, in part due to the fact they were designed as a single class supposed to be built to a single set of plans, but also because they were significantly larger and therefore would be more capable than all previous French pre-dreadnoughts, which had been very much built to a budget. With these ships displacing just under 15,000 tons, they would be considered equals to any number of other pre-dreadnought classes then being produced in the early 1900s, and this was thanks mainly to 2 factors. Firstly, the naval laws of Germany were beginning the wind-up of the German fleet to the scale that it would reach in World War I with the High Seas Fleet, thanks to Admiral von Tirpitz, which worried the French somewhat immensely. And also, it must be said, due to the efforts of Émile Bertin, who had, as we mentioned previously, finally managed to get himself appointed as the Director of Naval Construction, and had at last managed to batter the French naval boards into submission and convince them that no, you could not build smaller ships and rely on élan to defeat a much larger and numerically superior opponent. You actually had to build ships on a par with those that your enemies, or potential enemies, should we say, were building. And so we have the batteries. After an awful lot of toing and froing on the design front, these ships would be completed with a top speed of 18 knots, courtesy of 17,500 horsepower, a main belt of 11 inches thickness, or 280 millimeters, again of cemented Harvey nickel steel, which was face hardened, and the belt was beginning to increase towards a more recognizable belt, armoured deck and cellular backing system as seen in many other pre-dreadnoughts, as opposed to the somewhat eccentric previous extreme tumble-home narrow belt French designs of previous vessels. The main armament was also now beginning to approach something more rational, with 4 305mm guns in twin turrets, and the tertiary battery of 100mm guns taken out entirely in favour of a much larger secondary battery of 164mm guns, with a total of 18 weapons mounted in 6 twin turrets and 6 single casemates, with 24 47mm anti-torpedo boat guns, although these were very definitely not intended for engaging enemy capital ships with, and a reduction in torpedo tubes from 4 to 2. One of the early design proposals was to have the twin turrets equipped with 194mm guns, for a total of 12, backed up by 10 unshielded 100mm quick-firing guns, but this was rejected in favour of the uniform 164mm battery. The 6 ships were of course to be Patrie, République, Démocratie, Justice, Liberté, and Vérité. Despite predating the Invincible class of battlecruisers by almost half a decade, these ships were fully capable of having electrically powered turret training and elevation mechanisms without putting on something of a lightning show for everybody in the vicinity. However, despite this promising start in uniform construction, the changes inevitably would start to come in. One of them being the decree that all of the hull-mounted 47mm guns had to be replaced by 65mm guns, with 16 47s going in favour of 13 65s, because it was felt that torpedo boats were getting slightly too large and the 47mm wouldn't be quite as capable of stopping them as it had originally been considered. And then, of course, the British put their latest class of pre-dreadnought battleships into production, the King Edward VII, and whilst these ships still had 12-inch main guns and a secondary battery of 6-inch guns, this battery was actually now more broadly considered a tertiary battery, as the ships also included 4 9.2-inch or 234mm guns in turrets, along with the 6-inch guns, forming a somewhat heavier broadside than everybody else had anticipated. The French, who of course had decided on the 164mm turrets and casemates on the basis that they didn't need anything larger, were now somewhat taken aback. With the first 2 ships, it was too late to do anything, but with the last 4, starting with Démocratie, it was possible to make some changes before the ship was finalised. As a result, the 194mm gun was brought back into consideration, and the casement-mounted 164mm guns were replaced by 4 casement-mounted 194mm guns, whilst the twin 164mm turrets were replaced by single 194mm turrets, resulting in a total secondary battery of 10 194mm guns in the 6 single turrets and 4 casement mounts. As this overall led to a slight reduction in ship's displacement, the weight was put into thicker armour on the casemates and turrets, reflecting the higher status of the 194mm gun. However, these changes put the ship's construction back by 12 months, which meant that although the ships were generally considered very good if somewhat short-range pre-dreadnoughts in terms of gunnery, steaming and seakeeping, Republique was completed around the same time as HMS Dreadnought, and the last of the ships, the Verite, completed almost 2 years after that, which rather put them in the status of obsolete upon launch, unfortunately, which I say is a great pity due to the fact that they were actually fairly capable and had finally broken the French trend of designing a rather raggedy and patchwork fleet. The only real downside to the design was again the march of time, as by the time they were completed, battle range had now gone out, at least in the French estimation, to between 6,000 and 8,000 metres, whereas the first two ships with the 164mm armament had been designed for 2,000 to 3,000 metre engagement range, and the Démocratie subclass for 3,000 to 4,000 metres of engagement range, which would leave them at something of a disadvantage if they engaged in a modern gunfight. Lastly, in terms of French pre-dreadnoughts, would come the 6-strong Danton class. The Dantons had originally been considered as part of the fleet renewal program drawn up in 1900 in the face of Germany's initial naval expansion, but they only actually got round to discussing their construction in May 1905, and by the next year, Dreadnought was in service. This, however, did not deter the French, who decided they were going to press on with this pre-dreadnought design regardless. The design prepared was supposed to be an improved version of the Démocratie subclass of the Patrie class, and therefore would retain the four 305mm or 12-inch guns in two twin turrets, one forward and one aft. However, the secondary battery of 10 guns was upgraded to the 234mm gun. This was an increase even above the Démocratie subclass, as it was felt that the heavier firepower would be needed, especially considering that the Lord Nelson class, the last British pre-dreadnoughts, were increasing the number of 9.2-inch guns present on their ships, and the 240mm was a 9.4-inch weapon, which obviously was happily slightly larger than the British. These would be distributed in 6 twin turrets for a total of 12 guns, with a tertiary battery sneaking back in of 16 single 75mm guns, along with 10 single 47mm guns in a quaternary battery and 2 torpedo launchers. Some initial consideration was given to replacing the 6 twin 240mm turrets with 6 single 305mm turrets, which would then give them a all-big gun design, albeit not as efficient as HMS Dreadnought, SMS Nassau, or USS South Carolina, but this was rejected on the grounds that it would take too long to construct a new 305mm single turret design. The ships would also introduce steam turbines to the French capital ship fleet with a maximum speed of 19 knots, using 4 shafts, indicating a departure from the previous 3-shaft construction of prior French capital ships. The main armament would also use a new 305mm gun that was improved over what had been used on the Patries, and the bow was changed from a ram to a straight stem, both of these changes happening during construction in typical French manner, which didn't help with the duration of the build. Debates in various French political circles over exactly what kind of armament the ships should have, what kind of propulsion they should have, and all sorts of other factors, which politicians probably shouldn't be getting involved in, resulted in the ships only actually starting construction in 1907 and 1908, which meant that the French were only starting on pre-dreadnoughts up to 2 years after the HMS Dreadnought itself had hit the water. As a result of the new power plant, the ships would also sport 5 funnels, and again, these funnels would be largely to different shapes and sizes, and not at all uniform, which was a bit of a throwback to original French design. The final drawings, sent to the shipyards whilst many of them were midway through construction, featured no fewer than 500 separate modifications to the original plans which they'd been sent to start work on the ships. This meant that all of the builders pretty much had to dismantle and rebuild significant sections of what they'd already done, which would mean that the ships were 40% over their original estimated budget and took considerably longer to build. Armour was reduced to make up for the significant increases in armament, and a maximum thickness of 250mm, or 9.8 inches, was achieved. These ships would be launched in 1909 and 1910 and begin entering service into the Marine Nationale in 1911, rounding out the era of French pre-dreadnought construction. In the overall evaluation, the Dantons were actually a surprisingly successful ship. Their relatively heavy secondary batteries meant that at the close to medium ranges they were designed for, they could probably actually go toe-to-toe with early dreadnought battleships, using the heavier rate of fire of their secondary batteries to compensate for their lack of main armament. However, at the dreadnought and indeed most other navies' preferred engagement ranges around the time that they entered service, they would be at a significant disadvantage since this was beyond the effective range of their secondary battery. The ships in question being Danton, of course, Condorcet, Diderot, Mirabeau, Vergniaud, and Voltaire. Overall then, with this brief look at French pre-dreadnought design, although a number of the early French pre-dreadnoughts were both horrifically complicated, horrifically heterogeneous compared to their supposed sisters and half-sisters, and, to be honest, in some cases horrific to actually look at, the French Navy did actually recognise its failings fairly quickly and try to pull itself together into producing single classes of ship. Ienna and Suffren basically were a little bit of a retrograde step in that regard, but whilst many of those early designs had their faults and problems, by the time you got to the Patrie class and the Danton class, French pre-dreadnought design had, to a certain degree, hit its stride and produced a number of very solid, very powerful pre-dreadnought designs, constrained largely by political interference and a continued underappreciation of the combat ranges that ships would actually fight at within the French Navy. However, as I said, the Patrie and Danton classes in particular were very good ships for what they were designed for, and given that they spent a significant portion of their time facing off against the Austro-Hungarian Navy, I suspect that in any kind of major engagement they would have proved to be fairly effective and solid combat units. The one major problem with almost all French pre-dreadnoughts was that between a somewhat questionable underwater protection scheme and their tumble-home design, to varying degrees, they had a fairly low margin of stability when it came to underwater flooding, and this would be seen with a number of vessels, including Danton herself and Bouvet, at opposite ends of the spectrum, both of which would sink very rapidly when hit by torpedoes or mines. And so that wraps up a brief look at French pre-dreadnought design. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.